Okay, so some came to the conclusion that the Atman and the Brahman were essentially the same. That is, that reality within oneself, that permanent reality within oneself, existing in the innermost, one's innermost being. Sometimes it's said to be dwelling in the center of the heart. That reality is the same as the ultimate reality of the world. This was the message of the Upanishads. At least it's the dominant message of the Upanishads, the oldest Upanishads. That Atman, the innermost true self, is identical with Brahman, the real permanent reality behind the world. Other thinkers came to still other conclusions. Some held that the Atman and the Brahman, or the self and the world, were different, but each was a permanent reality in its own right. And then some came to the conclusion that the self arises with birth and lasts through the course of one's life, and then completely passes away and perishes at death. And so there was a wide variety of views about the self and the world that were thriving during the Buddha's time. And in the first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, called the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha has classified 62 current views about the self and the world. And the aim of the Buddha's teaching is not to arrive at a fixed view about the self and the world, because the Buddha understood that all of these views are different manifestations of craving or clinging. And so the aim for the Buddha's teaching is to overcome all fixed views about the self and the world. And so for this reason, when Maha Cunda comes to the Buddha to open a discussion, he asks about how one goes about abandoning and relinquishing all of these views. How one goes about abandoning and relinquishing all of these views that concern the self or the world. And so he phrases the question, I have to say it's a little bit obscure in the Pali, even to myself. So he says, now does the abandoning and relinquishing of those views come about in a bhikkhu, a monk, who is attending only to the beginning? Then the commentary says, or adds, of his meditative training. I won't try to explicate this sentence because it's rather obscure to me as well, and we don't find it repeated elsewhere in the suttas. But the Buddha's answer is what's important. The Buddha says, as to these various views that arise in the world, associated either with the doctrines of a self or with doctrines about the world, if in relation to those views, if in relation to that object on the basis of which those views arise, which they underlie, and which they are exercised upon, if one sees this object as it actually is with proper wisdom, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, then the abandoning and relinquishing of those views comes about. And this is a rather complicated way of saying that, I'll try to rephrase this in a simpler way. The way to overcome all of these views that arise concerning the nature of the self, the nature of the world, is to contemplate anything on the basis of which those views are formed as this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And according to the Buddha's teachings, when any views are formed about the self or about the world, they're all formed on the basis of what we call the 5 aggregates. That is, the 5 constituents of conditioned existence. Physical form, or the body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, volitional activities, and consciousness. And so the Buddha, whereas other thinkers in the Buddha's time formed the view, myself is the body, myself is feeling, myself is perception, myself is volitional activities, myself is consciousness. The Buddha developed this radical teaching of non-self, Anatta, that the way to overcome all of these binding views, these entangling views, is by turning this whole idea of the self on its head and instead adopting the standpoint of non-self, observing whatever one identifies with, whatever one clings to as being mine or myself, contemplating it, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And that is, we might call that is the essence or the crux of insight meditation. The meditation aimed at developing panya, wisdom. And so often one begins, sometimes usually with impermanence, because it's the most obvious characteristic. From there one comes to dukkha, whatever is impermanent is unsatisfactory, connected with suffering, defective. And then based on impermanence and dukkha, one comes to non-self. Whatever is impermanent, connected with suffering, is not myself. So that is the gradual, step-by-step way of developing insight. But for those with very sharp faculties, the book, don't jump to the conclusion. Let's not jump to the conclusion we belong in that category. But for those few rare ones with very sharp faculties, the Buddha can just begin directly by saying, contemplate that as not mine, not I, not myself. And then that brings the breaking of identification, ending of identification, through uprooting of all of these views about the nature of the self, the nature of the world.